There's a side of American history most people never see in textbooks. It lives in old recipe boxes, handwritten cards, and the memories of families who had to stretch every ingredient. These were the meals that got people through hard times, simple, cheap, and sometimes a little shocking. Today we're looking at 25 forgotten poor man's dinners that once kept millions of Americans fed. Squirrel stew. Let's open strong with something that sounds like a punchline but absolutely was not. Squirrel stew was a genuine fixture of Depression-era cooking, and not just in the backwoods either. Urban neighborhoods were getting in on this too. When unemployment hit a quarter of the country and the grocery store might as well have been a museum you could walk through but not buy anything from, people looked up into the trees and thought, well, there's dinner. While squirrel hunting became a real family activity, the kind of thing fathers took their sons out to do on a Saturday, not for sport, but for survival. The meat itself is actually pretty decent. People who've had it describe it as mild, a little nutty and tender, when it's been stewed low and slow with whatever root vegetables you could pull out of the ground. It's not gamey in the way that puts people off venison. Throw in some potatoes, some wild onions, and a little salt, and you've got yourself a proper meal. Would people today line up to make it? Probably not. But there's a reason this dish fed entire families through one of the darkest decades in American history. Hardtack. Hardtack is one of those foods that has outlasted entire civilizations, and honestly, you have to respect that. It's flour, water, and salt pressed together and baked until it turns into something roughly approximating a floor tile. That's not an insult. That durability is the whole point. Civil War soldiers carried it in their packs because it wouldn't rot, wouldn't crumble, and didn't need anything to keep it. Sailors ate it on months-long voyages for the same reason. The trouble was that eating it fresh, and I use the word fresh generously, required some strategy. You couldn't just bite into a dry piece of hardtack without risking a dental catastrophe, so most people soaked it in water, coffee, or broth, first to soften it up enough to chew. And here's the part nobody mentions in the romanticized history: weevils. Hardtack had a tendency to attract worm-like insects, and the unofficial workaround was to tap the cracker on the table before eating to knock them loose. For a food that costs almost nothing to make and keeps for years, that's a trade-off a lot of people were willing to accept. A lot of people still are, actually. Survivalists and long-distance hikers still make it today. Hobo stew. The name has stuck for over a century because it captures something true about what this dish actually was. Hobo stew wasn't a recipe, it was an attitude. You took whatever you had, tossed it in a pot, built a fire under it, and waited. The Depression sent hundreds of thousands of people riding the rails, traveling city to city looking for work, and open fires along the railroad tracks became a kind of communal kitchen. Somebody brought an onion. Somebody else had half a can of beans. A third person had a heel of bread and a couple of soft carrots. Into the pot, everything went. The result was always different, never guaranteed, and somehow always enough to take the edge off. It was filling in the way that only warm food eaten next to a fire can be filling, partly in the stomach and partly in the spirit. The people making it didn't have stoves or kitchens or measuring cups. They had a beat-up pot, a fire they kept going anyway for warmth, and enough hunger to make anything taste good. Bread and drippings. This one is humble even by the standards of this list, and yet it was a cornerstone of working-class eating for decades. Bread and drippings is exactly what it sounds like: a piece of bread, a smear of rendered animal fat, and not much else. Now, before you make a face, understand that in an era when bacon grease and beef drippings were just sitting in a can on the back of the stove, which is how most households operated, this wasn't considered sad food. It was practical food. Factory workers and day laborers would come home with sore backs and empty stomachs, and this was fast, filling, and cheap, in a way that almost nothing else could match. You had fat for energy, bread for carbohydrates, and if you were feeling fancy, you could throw a little salt on top. Some families added a scraping of lard, some used canned beef drippings. And here's the detail that surprises people the most. Some families put sugar on theirs. Drippings toast with a sprinkle of sugar was actually a common cheap breakfast in a lot of homes and diners. It sounds strange until you think about how sugar and fat together tend to taste, and then it sounds a little more understandable. Potato cakes. Potatoes have been bailing America out of tight spots longer than we've been keeping records, and potato cakes are maybe the most efficient use of that vegetable ever devised. The idea is beautifully simple. You've got leftover mashed potatoes from last night. They're sitting there, slightly stiff, taking up space. You press them into patties, pan-fry them until they get a golden crust on each side, and suddenly you have breakfast, or lunch, or a side dish that could stretch alongside almost anything else on the table. They showed up in diners, they showed up on farm tables, and they showed up in school cafeterias because they were cheap and kids would actually eat them. Add a drizzle of maple syrup and some thin apple slices alongside, and you've technically assembled a full morning meal. Potato cakes were the original leftover makeover, proof that nothing has to go to waste if you're willing to apply a little heat and a little patience. Boiled cabbage and potatoes. If potato cakes were resourceful, boiled cabbage and potatoes was bedrock. This is one of the most fundamental meals in the American working-class tradition. Two cheap, easy-to-grow vegetables, boiled together in salted water, with a little fat stirred in for flavor. That's the whole dish. And it was enough. Families who had victory gardens could grow both cabbage and potatoes in a backyard plot, which meant this meal was essentially free once the garden was established. One warm pot of it could feed a family for pennies, and with a small ham hock thrown in, just the bone really for flavor, it became something almost comforting. People used wilted cabbage for this without hesitation because throwing out food, even food that was past its prime, was simply not something you did. This dish carried families through both world wars and the depression between them. It's the kind of recipe that doesn't need a story to explain why it existed. The story tells itself. American goulash, also known as slum gullion, American goulash, has very little to do with its Hungarian ancestor, and it has made peace with that. This is a one-pot meal built around macaroni, ground beef, canned tomatoes, and whatever additional flavors you could afford to add. Hungarian goulash is a rich paprika-heavy beef stew with deep roots and strong opinions about authenticity. American goulash, by contrast, just wants to feed you and not cost a lot while doing it. In the South, they called it slum gullion, which is honestly a better name. As the decades passed and canned ingredients became more common, the recipe got looser and cheaper and more adaptable. Families who couldn't afford fresh ground beef could stretch it with canned meat. Families who couldn't afford canned tomatoes used ketchup. The whole thing evolved around whatever was available at the lowest possible price point. By the time most people encountered it, it barely resembled the original at all. But as a meal that fed hungry people out of a single pot for almost no money, it was nearly impossible to beat. Dandelion green salad. Here is where foraging enters the story, and it does not leave. Dandelion green salad was eaten by Appalachian families who understood what their land could provide, by Italian immigrant communities in cities who recognized a familiar ingredient from back home, and by Depression-era households who simply looked at their front yard and made a decision. The remarkable thing about dandelions is that they require no cultivation, no seed money, no garden plot, and no particular skill to find. They are, by definition, everywhere. You pull them up, cut away the roots and the flowers, wash the leaves, and dress them with a little vinegar, salt, and a hard-boiled egg if you have one. What you get is bitter and green and genuinely nutritious in a way that not many Depression-era foods could claim. Dandelion greens are packed with vitamins A, C, and K. Pennsylvania families were eating this salad well into the 1950s. And certain supermarkets actually sold dandelion greens as a produce item for much of the 20th century. Can you imagine walking past a pile of them in the produce aisle today? Cornbread and milk. Some dishes have staying power not because they're complicated, but because they hit something fundamental. And cornbread crumbled into a glass of milk is exactly that kind of dish. You take day-old cornbread, the stiff, slightly dried-out kind that's past its best moment, break it into chunks directly into a bowl or a glass, and pour cold milk over the whole thing. It softens immediately, turns a little soupy, and eats something like a very mild cereal. In the South, buttermilk was the preferred liquid, which added a tangy note that cut through the sweetness of the cornbread. Northern households and urban families who couldn't get fresh buttermilk often used regular milk with a little molasses or cane syrup stirred in. Was it an exciting meal? No. Was it warm, filling, and capable of using up every last crumb of bread without waste? Absolutely. And in a household counting every cent, that was all the recommendation anything needed. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich. This one is going to divide the room, and it always does. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwiches, which sounds wrong, which sounds like someone ran out of the right ingredients and tried to pretend they hadn't, were actually a staple, particularly from the Depression onward. When butter became expensive enough that morning toast was a luxury some families genuinely couldn't afford, mayonnaise stepped in as a spread. And peanut butter, which was cheap and shelf-stable, and the government literally pushed into relief programs, was the protein. Together on white bread, they made a meal that required no cooking, no dishes beyond the knife, and almost no money. The United States government had it stocked in food pantries and relief kitchens, which meant millions of Americans developed a genuine comfort association with it. Brands like Hellmann's and Duke's became household fixtures not out of preference, but out of dependency. Some people still make this sandwich today with a shrug and a fond memory. A few have discovered, somewhat reluctantly, that it's not actually bad. Bean and weenie casserole. There is something deeply American about this dish. It is not subtle, it is not sophisticated, but it is warm, it fills the pan, it feeds every person at the table, and it costs almost nothing. And in certain years of the 20th century, that combination was basically the definition of a great recipe. Bean and weenie casserole is canned beans, hot dogs sliced into coins, a sauce made from whatever starchy, savory elements were available, and everything baked together until it sets into a hot, bubbling, deeply satisfying mass. Hot dogs were the critical protein here, because fresh meat was either rationed during the war years or simply unaffordable during the Depression. Canned beans stretched the dish and added enough bulk that a small amount of meat could feed a large family. This casserole stayed in the American consciousness long enough that it actually enjoyed a nostalgic revival in the 1960s when boxed baking mixes and canned soups made it even easier to throw together. You still see versions of it at church suppers and potlucks to this day. Rice and raisins. Rice and raisins is not a glamorous dish, and it never pretended to be. What it was, reliably, was cheap, sweet enough to feel like a small indulgence, and filling enough to count as a proper meal rather than just a snack. You cooked the rice, you soaked the raisins if they were particularly dried out, and you combined them with a little milk and maybe a dusting of cinnamon if the budget allowed. The result was something that sat between porridge and pudding in texture. Soft, a little sticky, vaguely dessert-adjacent. Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens made this regularly, and certain Jewish and Amish communities had versions of it that they'd been making for generations. For families who had never thought of raisins as anything other than a baking ingredient or a lunchbox snack, the transition to rice and raisins as a main dish took some getting used to. But it was genuinely comforting in its simplicity. And food historians credit it with paving the way for rice pudding to become the beloved dessert it eventually did. Cabbage and noodles. Eastern European immigrants brought a lot of things with them to America. They brought their work ethic, their music, their tight-knit communities, their Catholic Church potlucks, and they brought haluski. Known by different names depending on who's making it, the competitor's script calls it hooky in some circles. This is a dish of egg noodles fried together with onions and shredded cabbage in butter or lard until everything gets soft and slightly caramelized. Slovak, a Polish and Hungarian families made it because they'd grown up with versions of it back home, and when they shared it with their new neighbors at community gatherings and church dinners, it spread fast. It spread partly because it was genuinely delicious in a humble way, and partly because it contained no meat, which meant it was easy for anyone to make regardless of their budget or religious dietary restrictions. It became a staple of the Appalachian region in particular. If you've never had it, the combination of silky noodles and slightly sweet fried cabbage is a lot better than it has any right to be. Depression-era ketchup spaghetti. Here's a dish that requires no introduction in certain households and genuine bewilderment in others. You cook spaghetti, you drain it, you toss it with ketchup. That's it. That is the full recipe. During the Depression and the wartime years that followed, canned marinara sauce was either unavailable in certain regions or simply too expensive relative to the humble bottle of ketchup that was already on the table. Ketchup is essentially cooked down, sweetened, and spiced tomatoes, so the flavor isn't completely foreign to what you'd want on pasta. It's just sweeter, thinner, and lacking the depth that a proper sauce develops. None of that mattered when you were feeding 3 kids on a budget that couldn't accommodate anything fancy. American soldiers stationed in the Pacific during World War II ate this too, improvising with whatever was in the mess hall. Some people still make ketchup spaghetti today as a deliberate throwback, a comfort food memory that doesn't apologize for what it is. Lard sandwich. The lard sandwich is the kind of meal that only makes complete sense when you understand who was eating it and why. Picture someone who has been doing physical labor for 10 or 12 hours, digging, hauling, lifting, building, and needs something high in calories and fast enough to prepare that they can eat it before the lunch break ends. Rendered pork fat spread on bread, topped with raw onion or a dusting of sugar, was that meal. Lard was significantly cheaper than butter or margarine through most of the Depression years. It had a rich, fatty flavor that was savory and filling in a way that something lighter could not replicate. The onion cut through the fat and added flavor without adding cost. The sugar version, which sounds strange, is actually a reasonable sweet and savory combination when you think about how well pork fat and sweet flavors work together. This was blue-collar fuel, the kind of lunch that got people through afternoon shifts. They were being paid almost nothing to work. Nutrition wasn't really the point. Staying on your feet was. Meatless meatloaf. The words meatless meatloaf are doing a lot of heavy lifting all at once, and the Depression era was very serious about it. When meat rationing was at its worst and even ground beef was either rationed by the government or simply out of reach financially, home cooks pivoted. They took the concept of a meatloaf, a filling, baked loaf that could feed the whole family, and rebuilt it from the inside out using whatever ingredients could convincingly play the role of meat. Lentils were common, so were black beans, breadcrumbs, mashed potatoes, and mushrooms. Peanut and cornmeal loaves appeared in cookbooks of the era without any sense of embarrassment, because the people writing those cookbooks were trying to actually help people eat. Some versions used walnuts for texture, some used oats. The goal in every case was to produce something that held its shape when sliced, had enough protein to feel substantial, and filled the table with the kind of warm, savory smell that meant dinner was ready. Whether any of them actually tasted like meatloaf is a separate question. Hush puppies. Hush puppies are one of those dishes that deserve better than their current reputation as a side dish afterthought. These are small, deep-fried cornmeal fritters, crispy and golden on the outside, soft and slightly sweet inside, and in their time they were a genuine staple, not a garnish. Cornmeal was one of the cheapest staples available in the South, often less expensive than wheat flour and significantly more versatile. Combined with a little egg, some milk or buttermilk, and a pinch of salt, it produces a batter that fries up beautifully in whatever oil or fat is available. The origin stories are numerous and contradictory. Some credit Confederate soldiers frying quick corn cakes over campfires. Others point to Cherokee and Creek traditions with similar corn preparations going back much further. Either way, what hush puppies represent is the Southern kitchen at its most practical, taking an extremely inexpensive ingredient and making it into something that people genuinely wanted to eat. The fact that this dish has faded from most home kitchens is, honestly, a loss. Shepherd's pie. Shepherd's pie has such a comfortable, established place in the American food landscape that it's hard to remember it was once a foreign dish that immigrants had to introduce to their new neighbors. Irish and English families who settled in New England, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest brought this recipe with them, layers of ground meat and vegetables, topped with a blanket of mashed potatoes, baked until everything melds together and the top goes golden. Depression-era families saw immediately what made it useful. The ratio of meat to filler could be adjusted based on what you had available. If meat was scarce, you used less and added more potatoes, more turnips, more whatever vegetables were stretching in the cellar. The dish accommodated scarcity without announcing it. It's worth noting that the shepherd's pie of the 1930s looked quite different from what we know today. Thinner on protein, heavier on root vegetables, and more obviously, a survival meal than a comfort food. It got a second wave of popularity when TV dinners put it back in front of American families in the 1950s, and by then, the lean years were far enough away that nobody was thinking about the original context anymore. Cabbage and bacon grease. Bacon grease was the original free ingredient. Every time you cooked bacon, which even in hard times happened occasionally because bacon fat was itself a cooking staple, you had drippings left in the pan. Nobody threw those away. They went into a can or a jar and sat on the back of the stove until needed, and when you had a head of cabbage but nothing else, you had something to cook it in. What bacon grease does to cabbage is genuinely impressive. It transforms a vegetable that is already fairly substantial into something deeper and richer. The fat coats each leaf and crisps the edges slightly, adding a smoky undertone that plain boiled cabbage completely lacks. It made a very small amount of food seem more substantial than it had any right to be. Was it nutritious? In the conventional sense, not particularly. Was it filling and warm and edible? Yes, completely. And in the hierarchy of Depression-era priorities, that ranked much higher than nutritional completeness. Still, of all the cabbage preparations on this list, this is the one most people today would probably pass on. Fair enough. Water pie. Water pie is the dish that makes people stop and read the name twice. Surely not, you think? And yet, yes. A pie filling made primarily of water was a real thing that people made and ate during the Depression, and it was considered a worthwhile dessert rather than an act of desperation they were ashamed of. The recipe starts with an unbaked pie crust, usually made with lard. Into it goes a mixture of hot water, sugar, flour, and butter, or a butter substitute. The flour thickens during baking, the sugar caramelizes slightly, and what comes out of the oven has a faint custardy quality. Not rich, not deeply flavored, but sweet and soft and recognizable as pie in the way that mattered most when pie had been absent from the table for months. People doctored it with vanilla if they had it, with a sprinkle of cinnamon, with whatever small thing might add a note of flavor. That it existed at all is a testament to how desperately people wanted something that resembled normal life. A pie, any pie, on the table meant things weren't completely gone. Sugar sandwiches. Nobody was sitting down to a sugar sandwich and pretending it was a five-star meal. But the sugar sandwich existed for a very specific reason in the architecture of daily depression eating. Dinner was the meal people protected. It was the largest, the most important, the one that had to keep working people fed enough to earn another day's wages. Lunch mattered because the midday break was the only rest a factory worker or farm laborer might get. But breakfast was where corners got cut. You needed something in your stomach before the day started, and if the household was genuinely scraping the bottom of the jar, a slice of white bread with a scattering of sugar on it was breakfast. Sometimes it was margarine and sugar. Sometimes it was lard with a heavy dusting. If there was a little honey available, that went on instead. Cinnamon made an appearance. The whole thing got a step up if you could toast the bread first, even just by holding it over an open burner. These were the small dignities people maintained in impossible circumstances. Something sweet in the morning, even if the sweet thing was just plain sugar. Cracker soup. Calling cracker soup a soup requires some generosity of spirit, but during the years when people were eating it, generosity was the one thing they had in abundance. You take saltine crackers, drop them into a bowl of hot water with a little butter, some pepper, and a bouillon cube if you had one, and you let the crackers absorb the liquid until they go soft. That's cracker soup. It has essentially no nutritional value beyond the calories in the crackers and the fat in the butter. And it is not satisfying in the way a proper soup is satisfying, and yet people found it genuinely useful. It was light and warm on a sick stomach. It required no cooking equipment beyond a way to heat water. It was what soldiers and field workers ate when even the most basic cooking wasn't feasible. Families gave it to children who were ill because the soft, warm crackers went down easy and stayed down. There's something almost touching about a dish this simple being considered comfort food. But in context, it makes complete sense. Warm and soft and not demanding anything of you. Sometimes that's exactly what a person needs. Poor man's pasta. Poor man's pasta goes by several names. Some people call it pasta with breadcrumbs, some call it a poverty pasta, and the basic idea is to replace expensive cheese and meat with the cheapest possible stand-ins. Pasta was a dry pantry staple that cost almost nothing per serving and kept indefinitely on the shelf. What you cooked it with was the question. A toasted breadcrumbs, stale bread ground up and fried in a little oil, stood in for the grated cheese that families couldn't afford. Garlic, onion, and red pepper flakes provided enough flavor to make the dish feel complete rather than incomplete. This version was particularly common in urban Italian-American neighborhoods in New York and Chicago, where families who knew real pasta were making a version they could actually afford without feeling entirely defeated by the substitution. It's a dish that has mostly vanished from American tables because pre-made pasta sauces and affordable cheese have made the original version accessible again. But as a solution to the problem of wanting pasta and not having the ingredients for it, it was quite clever. Cornbread with blackstrap molasses. Cornbread paired with blackstrap molasses is a Southern survival combination that is significantly more interesting than it first appears. Blackstrap molasses is the darkest, most concentrated byproduct of the sugar refining process, thick, almost tar black, intensely bittersweet, and loaded with iron, calcium, and B vitamins in quantities that put most conventional foods to shame. In the sugar-producing South, a molasses was abundant and cheap precisely because it was a byproduct that the industry would otherwise discard. Combined with cornbread, which was itself inexpensive and calorie-dense, you had a meal that was nutritionally robust in ways that most Depression-era food was not. Sharecroppers ate this regularly. It was a generational staple across backgrounds and communities throughout the rural South. Some people believed blackstrap molasses had medicinal properties, particularly for preventing anemia, and given its iron content, they weren't entirely wrong. This is one of those Depression-era foods that modern nutritionists would actually look at and nod approvingly. A rare distinction: rice and vinegar. Plain white rice dressed with vinegar is not a combination that most Americans would have arrived at independently, and they didn't. This one came in through the immigrant communities that were settling along the coasts during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Chinese, Japanese, and Southeast Asian families for whom a bowl of plain rice was a perfectly normal and complete meal, not a side dish waiting for something more important to arrive beside it. The vinegar added acidity that made the rice more interesting without costing anything meaningful. For American families who encountered this combination during the Depression, it took some adjustment. Rice as a standalone meal was unfamiliar. Plain rice with vinegar as a deliberate dish rather than an accident was even more unfamiliar. But when the wallet was truly empty and the stomach was truly empty, unfamiliar became acceptable remarkably quickly. It's a combination that still exists in various forms across Asian cuisines, dressed up with different vinegars and aromatics. In Depression America, it was just whatever vinegar you had and however much rice you could spare. Vinegar pie. Vinegar pie is one of the cleverer acts of culinary substitution on this list, and it deserves more credit than it typically gets. The premise is that vinegar can stand in for fresh citrus. The tartness is different, but the acidic punch achieves a similar effect. You make a basic custard filling using eggs, sugar, butter, and vinegar instead of lemon juice, pour it into an open pie shell, and bake it until it sets. Many people finished it with a meringue on top, and which was smart. The sweet, pillowy meringue softened the sourness of the filling and transformed the whole thing into something that felt genuinely celebratory. Vinegar pie was popular in Pennsylvania starting in the early 1930s and spread wherever people had the basic ingredients and a sweet craving they couldn't afford to satisfy any other way. People brought it to celebrations. They made it for birthdays and holidays, when the budget absolutely did not allow for anything more extravagant. It was a small joy carried in a pie tin, and in a decade full of very few small joys, that meant something. Crispy fried grasshoppers. This is the entry where some of you are going to test your own open-mindedness, and I encourage you to lean in. During the Dust Bowl, grasshoppers were not a novelty or an extreme food challenge. They were a food source that Dust Bowl families turned to because grasshoppers were destroying their crops anyway, and it seemed like a reasonable act of revenge to eat them. Families would gather them in buckets, wash them, marinate them in whatever spices were available, and fry them in oil until they went crispy and golden. The result was a crunchy, high-protein snack that wasn't too far off from certain things you'd find in a bag at a gas station. Nutritionally, grasshoppers are genuinely impressive, high in protein, rich in iron, and containing healthy fats. The Dust Bowl families eating them weren't thinking about nutrition science, but they were getting something genuinely nourishing out of a landscape that was providing very little nourishment. The fact that we now discuss insect protein as a futuristic sustainable food concept while pretending the Depression never happened is a bit ironic, isn't it? Onions stuffed with Grape-Nuts. Grape-Nut cereal, the cereal that famously contains neither grapes nor nuts, turns up in some of the strangest places in Depression-era cooking, and stuffed onions is one of the stranger ones. The recipe involved hollowing out whole onions, mixing the chopped insides with pork sausage meat, ketchup, melted fat, and grape-nut cereal as a binder and extender, and baking the whole thing until the onion softened and the filling cooked through. Our grape-nuts was shelf-stable, inexpensive relative to other ingredients, and had a dense, substantial quality that made it useful as a filler in meat dishes, where the meat needed to go further than it naturally would. The finished dish was actually considered quite satisfying, warm, savory, and surprisingly substantial for something built primarily around an onion. The 1940s and 1950s produced a lot of recipes like this, dishes that were simple and filling and made everyone at the table feel like they'd been properly fed. That combination was the culinary holy grail of the era, and this particular recipe achieved it. Vinegar cobbler. If vinegar pie represents clever substitution, vinegar cobbler takes it one step further and makes the substitution the entire point of the dish. Cobblers are traditionally built around fruit. The jammy, sweet, slightly tart filling beneath a biscuit or pastry topping is what defines them. When fresh fruit was out of season or out of budget, and apple cider vinegar was sitting in the pantry being cheap, someone figured out that the vinegar could mimic the tartness of fruit well enough to carry the dish. The filling was vinegar, sugar, spices, and occasionally a thickener, poured under a biscuit crust and baked. The result is described as tasting something like a custard with a sharp, salty, sweet tang, unusual but not unpleasant. This falls squarely in the category of desperation pies, which is an actual term food historians use for the pies that proliferated before refrigeration made off-season fruit available year-round. Vinegar cobbler is the most extreme member of that category. It's the version that commits most fully to the spirit of the thing, which is, we are making dessert with what we have, and we are going to enjoy it. Hoover stew Herbert. Hoover has not enjoyed a particularly warm historical reputation, in large part because the stew named after him was eaten by millions of Americans who blamed him for why they needed it. Hoover stew was, like Hobo stew, a catch-all recipe built from scraps and leftovers. It was made in large quantities, fed whole families, and cost almost nothing. Hot dogs were often the protein, again, the cheap, accessible meat option. Canned beans or canned vegetables stretched the broth. And whatever odds and ends were in the kitchen went in too. The defining characteristic of Hoover stew wasn't what it contained, but how it was made, communally, in big pots, in parks, and soup kitchens and churchyards for whoever showed up hungry. There was no fixed recipe. There was just a pot big enough and a fire underneath it. As the economy eventually recovered through the late 1930s and into the war years, Hoover stew faded away, not mourned exactly, but not forgotten either by the people who'd relied on it during years they would have preferred not to have lived through. Fried cow brains. Here we arrive at one of those dishes that requires a full reframing of how we currently think about food and waste. Fried cow brains, or calf's brains if you want the version that sounds slightly more palatable, were a Dust Bowl staple, not because anyone was excited about them, but because the philosophy of the time was absolute. When you slaughtered an animal, you used every part of that animal. Full stop. Wasting any portion of it, including the brain, was simply not something people did. The preparation was straightforward. Brains were washed in cold water or milk to remove blood, dredged in flour, and fried in a pan until golden and crispy on the outside. The texture inside is soft, almost creamy. Some people describe it as similar to scrambled eggs, which is a comparison that does not help everyone. The flavor is mild and slightly buttery. People who ate them often mention that they were more pleasant than expected, which seems to be the verdict on most things in this category. They were dense in protein and fat, which made them genuinely nutritious. The fact that we now recoil from them says less about the food and more about how far we've moved from the practicalities of consuming a whole animal. Chopped liver substitute. Chopped liver was a beloved dish in certain communities, particularly Jewish households, and losing access to good quality liver during rationing and economic hardship was a real culinary problem that people addressed with some creativity. The substitute was built from green lentils, caramelized onions, walnuts, hard-boiled eggs if available, and enough salt and pepper to bring the whole thing together into a paste with a texture not entirely unlike the original. It was cheaper than liver, easier to obtain during shortage periods, and once you'd adjusted your expectations, it provided a similar role on the table, spread on bread, served alongside a meal, used as an appetizer. What surprised people was that the substitute developed its own loyal following. Some families preferred it. It was healthier, honestly, and the walnut-lentil combination has a rich, earthy quality that works genuinely well together. Some people kept making it long after the war ended and fresh liver was available again, simply because they'd grown to like it. That's an unusual outcome for a Depression-era survival dish. Spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole. Eleanor Roosevelt gets a lot of credit in Depression-era food history, and not all of it is flattering. She famously promoted budget recipes from the White House, and this casserole was one of them. The idea was to demonstrate to American homemakers that nutritious, filling meals could be made from simple, affordable ingredients. Spaghetti was cooked long, 25 minutes or more, until it went genuinely soft. Our carrots were boiled separately until tender. Everything was layered together and covered with a white sauce made from milk, flour, butter, and salt. The result was a vegetable-forward casserole that was genuinely mild, filling, and easy to adapt based on whatever was available. Critics of the First Lady's food program pointed out, not entirely unfairly, that the White House kitchen had access to things most households didn't. But the recipe itself was real and workable, and families made it. It's the kind of dish that doesn't inspire passion, but reliably fills a table, which is sometimes exactly what's needed. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush is porridge in its most unfussy American form. You stir cornmeal into boiling water, slowly, to prevent lumps, and cook it until it thickens into something between oatmeal and polenta. Hot, it eats like a very neutral porridge that needs something on top of it to have any real personality. Cold, it sets firm enough to be sliced and fried, which gives it a completely different texture and makes it much more interesting. During the Depression and into the wartime years, cornmeal mush made sense because cornmeal was one of the cheapest grains available. It was filling and it was adaptable. Topped with maple syrup, it was breakfast. Fried into patties, it was a side dish. Mixed with other things, it was a base. It didn't generate much excitement. People who ate it did so because they needed to eat it, and it was available, not because they'd chosen it from a list of attractive options. Once the economy improved and actual breakfast food became accessible again, cornmeal mush retreated. It's still made in certain parts of the South and Appalachia, but it's a niche dish now rather than the daily reality it once was. Breaded pig snouts. Every part of the pig, that was the standard. And pig snouts, which are cartilaginous and rich in collagen, were absolutely on the table, literally. They were cleaned thoroughly, cooked until soft in simmering water, and then breaded and deep-fried until they went crispy on the outside. The result was reportedly quite good, a substantial crunch on the exterior giving way to tender, fatty, nay, flavorful meat that wasn't dramatically different from other fried pork preparations people were familiar with. This wasn't considered exotic or extreme by Dust Bowl families. It was just the part of the pig they were cooking today instead of yesterday's part. The cultural aversion to eating awful and unusual animal parts is a relatively modern luxury, the product of a food system so abundant that we can afford to be selective. When you can't be selective, you discover that quite a lot of the parts you'd been throwing away were perfectly good to eat. Pig snouts are a case in point. Economy loaf. The economy loaf is a Depression-era cousin of the meatless meatloaf, a baked loaf made entirely without meat and designed to be as filling as possible with the cheapest available ingredients. Potatoes, peas, flour, eggs, and whatever seasonings the household had on hand were combined and baked into a loaf that held its shape well enough to be sliced and served. It appeared in cookbooks of the era, including the aptly titled Modern Hostess cookbook, without any sense of apology. It was practical, it fed people, and it represented what a lot of wartime cooking looked like, taking the form of a meat-centered dish and filling it with vegetables and grains instead. Economy loaf was considered an acceptable contribution to the wartime effort of not wasting resources, which gave it a patriotic framing that took some of the edge off the fact that it was meatless. Today it would be marketed as a vegan protein dish and sold for $15 a slice at a certain kind of restaurant. Kraft Macaroni and Cheese Dinner. Here is the one entry on this list that didn't fade into obscurity. It went in the exact opposite direction and became one of the most commercially successful food products in American history. Kraft Macaroni and Cheese debuted in 1937 during the heart of the Depression, priced at 19 cents for 4 servings. A traveling salesman had been attaching packets of Kraft grated cheese to tenderoni macaroni boxes and selling them together, and Kraft recognized the genius of the pairing and brought it to market properly. It was cheap, fast, required almost nothing to prepare, and tasted like something comforting rather than something desperate. Families added vegetables to it when they had them, stirred in a can of tuna when the budget allowed for a little protein. Kids loved it. Adults relied on it. It sold 9 million boxes in its first year. The Great Depression produced a lot of food that people couldn't wait to stop eating once circumstances improved. Kraft mac and cheese was the rare exception. People kept eating it by choice long after they could have afforded something else. Boiled carrot sandwiches. The boiled carrot sandwich is a product of the Depression's worst stretches, when even cheap produce was getting difficult and people were looking for anything that could plausibly fill a sandwich without spending money they didn't have. Carrots were boiled until completely soft, mashed or sliced, and placed between 2 pieces of bread. Sometimes a little seasoning was added. Sometimes there was butter or margarine on the bread. The result was not exciting, but it was warm and soft and provided enough substance to constitute a meal, which was the requirement. Americans have a strong cultural attachment to sandwiches as a format. They feel like a real meal in a way that a bowl of plain vegetables might not, even if the nutritional content is similar. The sandwich form gave the boiled carrots a dignity they might not have had otherwise. When economic conditions improved and people could fill their sandwiches with more traditional ingredients, the boiled carrot sandwich disappeared without much ceremony. It had done its job. Blood gravy. Blood gravy occupies a position on this list that is simultaneously the most alarming and the most practically sensible entry we've encountered. When you butchered an animal and had access to the blood, which you collected because you collected everything, you had the makings of a sauce. Fresh animal blood, typically from pigs or cattle, was mixed with flour, milk, and spices and cooked into a thick, dark gravy that was served over biscuits or potatoes. It was intensely nutritious, rich in iron and protein, and genuinely filling. The flavor is described as deep and savory, more intense than conventional gravy, with a metallic note that the seasoning was meant to balance. People who grew up eating blood gravy in the South and Appalachia often describe it as a comfort food they still think about. Blood-based preparations are not unusual globally. Black pudding in Britain, dinuguan in the Philippines, morcilla throughout Latin America, and the Dust Bowl version is simply the American entry in a long international tradition. The knowledge of how to make it has largely vanished from American kitchens, which is either a cultural loss or a reasonable adaptation, depending on your perspective. Sawdust bread. This is the entry where the desperation of certain periods really becomes impossible to minimize. Sawdust bread, bread that had been deliberately extended with sawdust because flour was running critically short, was real. It was not a rumor. It was not an exaggeration passed down through family stories. Families who were completely out of flour and completely out of options mixed sawdust into their bread dough to make the flour go further. You could taste it. And the bread was grittier, denser, and often went stale faster than normal bread. Using too much sawdust made the bread unsafe, and people learned that through unpleasant experience. But in the right proportions, it functioned as a filler when there was no alternative filler to be had. It's the fact that cellulose fiber, which is derived from processed wood pulp, became a common additive in commercial bread and other foods starting in the 1970s, means that the concept of sawdust extended food has a longer American history than most people realize. The Depression just happened to make the process very visible and very blunt. Ritz mock apple pie. The Ritz cracker mock apple pie is one of the most audacious recipes to come out of the Depression, and the fact that it worked, that people tasted it and genuinely questioned whether there were apples inside, is a remarkable thing. The Ritz Cracker Company actually put the recipe on the back of the box, which is either a testament to its quality or a very savvy marketing move, probably both. You make a standard double pie crust, fill it with whole Ritz crackers soaked in a syrup of sugar, water, cinnamon, and lemon juice, dot it with butter, and bake it closed. The crackers absorb the spiced syrup and become soft. The lemon and cinnamon create the flavor profile that your brain associates with cooked apples. The result, people consistently reported, tasted genuinely like apple pie. The mock apple pie has roots going back to the mid-1800s, when winter travelers and prairie homesteaders used soda crackers in the same way. The Depression brought it back because apples were expensive and Ritz crackers were not, and an American public that desperately wanted something to feel normal found that a warm slice of this pie did exactly that. Egg drop soup. Egg drop soup, as an American Depression-era food, is a slightly different creature from the Chinese original, but shares its essential economy. Eggs were one of the most affordable proteins available, even during the leanest years, because backyard chickens were common and eggs were cheap. The Depression-era American version built a soup around broth. Chicken broth if you had chicken bones to boil, a hot water with bouillon if you didn't, and then whisked in beaten eggs that were drizzled in a slow stream into the hot liquid, creating those characteristic silky ribbons. Ginger, chives, and sometimes anchovies or olives were added for flavor. Shredded leftover chicken elevated it when available. It was a way to turn very little into something that felt complete and warming. A full bowl of soup from not much more than an egg and some hot water with flavor in it. Families who'd never made anything like it before found that it was easy, fast, and significantly more satisfying than its ingredient list suggested it should be. Skunk stew. Skunk stew exists at the absolute frontier of Depression-era food. The point at which we ate what we could find stops being a general statement and becomes a very specific one. Skunks were not desirable game. Nobody was excited about hunting skunk. But in the Dust Bowl years, when the land had largely stopped producing food and commercial meat was impossible to afford, farmers and rural families hunted whatever was available, and skunks were available. The process was involved. The scent glands had to be carefully removed before cooking, because leaving them would make the meat inedible in a different and much more immediate way than usual. Once properly cleaned and prepared, the skunk was stewed with whatever vegetables and spices were on hand. People who ate it described the meat as soft and somewhat gamey. Not pleasant exactly, but edible, which was the requirement. Interestingly, some accounts suggest skunk was less strongly flavored than other wild game like raccoon or possum, which puts it in a strange and exclusive category of being the least bad option. That is as much of an endorsement as it was going to get. Mock brains. Mock cuisine during rationing could get surprisingly specific, and mock brains is one of the more specific examples. With actual fried cow brains falling out of availability, either because animals were being reserved for other purposes or because even the offal had become harder to access. People who had developed a taste for brains looked for a substitute. The mock version was typically built from heavily seasoned ingredients that replicated the rich, fatty, intensely savory character of real brains through spice, rather than through actual animal matter. Hickory smoke, paprika, garlic, and plenty of fat were combined to create a paste or preparation that evoked the original. Served with tomato sauce, it scratched the specific craving that mock cuisine always aimed to address. These recipes recognize something important about food and psychology, that what people often miss most during hard times isn't just nutrition, but specific flavors and textures that carry emotional weight. Mock brains were an attempt to give people back something they'd lost, even if the something was a fairly unusual thing to lose in the first place. And that's our look at some of the meals people once relied on when times were hard and every ingredient mattered. Some were clever, some were rough, but every one of them kept someone fed when there wasn't much else on the table. Now I'm curious, which one of these would you actually try? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoy forgotten food history like this, make sure you're subscribed for the next one.